Okay, and to understand this period, we obviously have to rely heavily on Roman or Greco-Roman and Syriac sources because they're the
Yeah.
most contemporary to the events they describe. But you also classify Islamic era Arabic material as outsider sources for pre-Islamic history. I don't believe it's simply because they're later, although that sometimes causes problems too, but because of the major ideological and social changes that have taken place by the time those texts were written. Some scholars have pushed back on this distinction, arguing that privileging late antique Greco-Roman or Syriac accounts often overlook the fact that those authors had their own agendas, limited contact with Arabia, and often misunderstood the communities they were describing. So I said all that to say this. So taking into account the contemporaneity of the late antique sources, the ideological distance of the Islamic ones, and the biases present in both, how do you see the relationship between these different bodies of evidence? And how should they be used together to reconstruct pre-Islamic Arabia?
So I think this is probably the ultimate question of this whole discipline, which is the huge problem with the sources. Um, so to be fair, the outsider sort of concept is I think it was originated by Robert Hoyland, and then we kind of took it up. And the Roman sources are also outsider sources. So the Roman ones are obviously outsider sources because they're written by observers. And the Islamic era sources are outsider sources because they're displaced by centuries from the topic they discuss, and similarly written by people thinking about things that they have no direct experience of. So, the very frustrating issue with studying this is that the corpus of insider sources produced by the Arabs themselves is tiny in comparison to what's available from outsiders. And you're absolutely right that the Romans in particular and the Greeks before them have significant biases. I mean, I think it's Herodotus who talks about Arabia with camel leopards and huge nuggets of gold that can be dug out of the ground with little effort and all this kind of fanciful nonsense. The Romans have their own biases, as mentioned earlier. They're really only interested in things that have to do with war and diplomacy, and that's when they notice, individuals like Al Harith. And the same is true in the West. Their historians get motivated to talk about the Goths when individual Goths cause problems, or Huns, or Vandals, or whoever. Um, the sort of, I think it's fair to say that one consensus, not the consensus, but one consensus that's emerged is that we can try and use all the sources together and look for commonalities between them. So I'll give you an example. In around the turn of the sixth century, there is a series of disturbances in what would now be northern Saudi Arabia, near sort of the Jordanian border, which is sort of interpreted as intertribal rivalry and fights, skirmishes with the Roman army. Out of this emerges the superphilog system. This is discussed by numerous contemporaries and also is repeated later on by Theophanes, who's writing, I believe, in the ninth century. But accounts of this same event also then show up in Muslim historians who even correctly name the emperor Anastasius. So when you can find these elements of commonality, it gives you a sense of confidence that you have different versions of the same story, different memories of the same thing, but there's sufficient agreement between them to say, okay, this is what was going on at the time. The opposite is true. For example, Al-Sfahani has a very exciting narrative about the Jafnid kings, where he imagines they ruled for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and they built all these structures, which has spawned a whole subdiscipline of Jafnid or Ghassanid buildings. None of these exist. The kings are made up, and Al-Sfahani had his own stuff going on, and he's not a credible source for the history of the Jaffnids. The more credible source is Procopius because he's an observer at the time and knows about these individuals. So that's an example of where they don't meet.
Hmm.
The best thing to do, I believe it's Aziz Al-Azmi who's come up with the this, we can have a sensible approach to Islamic sources rather than dismissing them outright as too removed or fanciful or ideologically suspect. We can, use them in the same way that we use other sources, which is with care. And it's a remarkably straightforward, simple idea that he proposed, but I think somebody had to say it because we all became too almost too afraid to look at them
Mm.
for fear that they might just be too outrageous. And instead, we approach Roman sources with the same way. They can also be outrageous. They also lie. They're also fanciful. They blatantly make things up. They have their own ideological axes to grind. So if we can put all these sources together in the same sort of critical approach that historians use anyway, then they can be safely used.
So, continuing on the subject of sources, you describe the study of inscriptions and archaeological sources as one of the most exciting areas of research in the field of pre-Islamic history. As this area of research is constantly developing, have there been any epigraphic or archaeological discoveries since you published your last book that have affected any of your previous conclusions?
I'm really glad you asked this question because yes, epigraphy is where it's at. This is where this is where the new discoveries are going to be made. Unless we magically find the lost part of Ammianus Marcellinus, where he promises a huge digression about the Saracens, but it's in his lost bit, and he very frustratingly mentions it, and then of course we don't have it. This is where things will be found. So um, there have been a number of discoveries. So they are discussed in my recent work, but I want to bring them up anyway because they kind of some of them are and some of them aren't, but it will show you how or show the listeners how things can sort of radically be altered by a chance discovery. So in 2009, engineers were enlarging access to the airport road that goes to Queen Alia Airport in Amman, and they bulldozed right through a hill, which was a pre-existing archaeological site, but they didn't. It wasn't known that there was a church there, which they exposed when they were building this new road. And in it, there was a mosaic inscription that referred to Almundia. And the church was a church of St. Sergius, which is a saint that's closely connected with the Jaffnid dynasty. And the very exciting thing about this was that it uncovered a new Roman title for Almundia. Unfortunately, the mosaic was damaged in antiquity where the date was, which left a lot of guesswork on our part. But it showed a sort of form of preparation for Al-Mundir because he held an inferior title to his father. And we theorized that this is reflecting a period in his career where his father was still alive. In 563, his father Al-Harith was summoned to Constantinople to meet with the Emperor Justinian, talk about who would succeed him. And it's thought that this is kind of like part of his preparation, that the Romans gave him a low grade title in the senatorial order, inferior to that of his father. And he's sort of being groomed to take over, which he eventually did in 569. So that's one example. I mean, that was a very exciting discovery. Unfortunately, the mosaic appears now to have been destroyed. There are two other examples we can use. One is the very exciting discovery by Saudi archaeologists with their French colleagues working in southern Saudi Arabia, where they unearthed a series of funerary inscriptions that were written in an early form of the Arabic script, but used the dating formulae from the province of Arabia in the Roman Empire, which reckons time from the annexation of the province by Trajan. And the interesting thing about this was they were Christian inscriptions that were written in Arabic and used a Roman dating formula. And they were found so far from the geographical region of the province and in a completely different part of the peninsula to where other inscriptions of this type have been found that it raises a sort of question of a pan-Arab identity. And I'm jumping ahead a bit, so I know this is on the questions for later. But where an Arab identity might be sort of expressed by a shared Christianity and a shared allegiance to Rome. So that's one thing that's another example. And the most recent one is Ahmed Al-Jalad and his colleague Ali Al-Manasa last year in Jordan uncovered an inscription, again, written in an early form of Arabic, referring to Al-Mundir. And the three of us have now published that. It's going to be coming out in Arabian Archaeology and Epigraphy shortly. But that is the first ever Paleo-Arabic inscription that references Al-Mundir. So that's very exciting. So every year, thanks to the efforts of people like Christian Raban, the Saudi archaeologists, working with their French teams in around Hima in southern Saudi Arabia, thanks to Ahmad Ali Al-Manissa and people like them, and Michael McDonald, of course, there is every chance of finding new epigraphic texts every year, and that's where the advances are going to be, and that's where we're going to find those mythical insider sources that we're so desperate to find.
Right. Which I really hope Saudi opens. They're starting to open up more to archaeological research, but I can't wait till they kind of open up a lot more so we can actually see
Absolutely.
what's under. If all of the construction that's been going on hasn't damaged anything or made things almost impossible to recover. But